Hello and welcome to day 2 of the WEAR webinar series focused on rebuilding the fashion industry. I'm really excited for the sessions that we have here today. And many of you, I'm sure, joined us yesterday we had 4 really engaging sessions around the social impacts, supply chain, supplier relations, human rights in fashion. So that was really an amazing day, and I'm sure we're going to have another one today as we look at setting science-based targets for the fashion industry. This first panel we're just waiting on one of our panelists to join us, but we are looking at going beyond carbon. Oftentimes when we think of science-based targets, we are really speaking to carbon, but what about water and what about forests? And so we're going to hear today from our incredible experts on these different topics, and then we will also be going into a breakout on both water and carbon. So many of you have signed up for one of those breakouts. I'm going to be coming back on at the end of this panel to give you some instructions as to how to enter that breakout. While we're waiting for people to join, it'd be great if you could just use the chat function and let us know what city you're joining us from. Hello, Janice. Let me just make sure you're not muted. Okay, there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Hello.
Great.
Janice, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So Janice, I was going to ask, you were going to go first. Is that still okay after the intros?
Sure. I have my colleague dialing in. How are we? Are we sharing our presentations? Did you already do the test?
Yes, so we're live now and we're recording. We have attendees all signing in here. So we are going to allow you to share your screen. So you all have co-host capabilities now, and you'll be able to share your slides when it's your turn. So Honduras, oh, welcome back for day 2. Okay. So yeah, if you're just signing in, let us know where you're coming from, as we're just giving it another minute or 2 for people to come in. Okay. And Janice, I'm gonna send you an email about the breakouts because we missed that chat. Okay. All right. Well, why don't we get started just for the sake of time? So once again, we're looking at setting science-based targets for the fashion industry today in this 1-hour panel. There will be a breakout session that follows, and if you've chosen to do the breakouts, you will have been pre-assigned into either water or carbon, and I will be sharing a link towards the end of this panel that you will need to click to actually enter into those breakout rooms. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Helen Crowley, who is a conservation advisor to the World Economic Forum, who's currently on sabbatical from caring. Welcome, Helen, and thank you for being with us today. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Unmute. Thank you. Hello. Sorry, the mute was out of my control for a moment. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you have joined this session. This is a super important topic that we're going to talk about today. As you have no doubt noticed, we're in unprecedented times with respect to climate and nature. Nature is all around us and has been supporting us as a society and as individuals and as businesses for many, many thousands of years, but it is really breaking down. And the reports just that came out last week on nature, the Living Planet report from World Wildlife Fund, as well as the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity report showed not only since 1970 have we lost 68% of plants and animals, but that we also haven't met our targets that were set a decade ago. So this idea of targets and action is very, very pertinent. And we know that we need to understand impact and risk. We need to set targets and we need to track our results against them, but we need to make sure they are the right targets and that we need to be committed to the right actions, because as the scientists and experts tell us, we have a decade of delivery ahead of us, a decade to get to 1.5 degrees or less temperature and climate change, and to bend the biodiversity curve up. So to start restoring and protecting biodiversity and nature. We have 10 years. It really can be seen to be daunting, but it also is very exciting times, because at the same time as that we have this challenge ahead of us, we also have a great amount of data. We have incredible methodologies with remote sensing and science, and we have an incredible willingness, particularly in this sector. The Fashion Pact that brought together 68 brands, 68 companies, sorry, and so a couple of hundred brands, and representing 30% of the sector last year, to commit to climate, oceans and biodiversity targets, is just one of many examples of the willingness of the private sector to really engage. So now we have to bring the science and that willingness together to say, okay, what are we going to do? We can't waste time. We've got to hone our focus, and we've got to do the right actions in the next decade to get the results that we need for nature and climate. And climate has had a bit of a head start. We've got the Science Based Targets Initiative with over 800 companies signed up that helps chart a pathway for companies to actually set targets that will keep them within the 1.5 degree temperature rise, which is a sort of that's our planetary boundary, if you like. That's sort of a science-based target in itself. We want to stay within a boundary of climate change. We'd be lovely if we didn't have climate change, but it's here. We've got to keep it mitigated as much as possible. And now we're looking at how do we do that with other Earth systems. So if you look at climate as one Earth system, there are other Earth systems like forests and the biosphere, the biodiversity of the world. There is the water systems. There are things called geochemical flows and systems. So there are different systems that keep our Earth and our survival possible. So now there is an initiative called Science Based Targets for Nature, which is again looking at this planetary boundary concept and say, what do we need to do so that we can live within a safe and just, but the science is focusing on the science around safe operating space for humanity. There's a just element that comes in as well, because it has to be just for society. So what is it that we need to do to stay, or to pull us, in fact, back within that boundary so that we can survive and thrive as a society, as businesses, as individuals? And that's what science-based targets are all about, for climate and for nature. And nature encompasses the living elements as well as the abiotic or the non-living elements of our world, the water, the biodiversity, the land, the oceans, and there's living and non-living in that. And the science-based target for nature is trying to really tackle what it is you can do in those different realms as companies and as cities to keep maintaining a business but still keeping within that safe operating space. So that's what we're going to explore a bit today, because you've got to be setting the right targets and moving pretty dramatically and effective along with confidence along a pathway of action that you can track progress. So we have three fantastic speakers today, and we're going to tackle different elements of this. Firstly, we're going to look with Janice Noronha of PwC at water and understanding what are fashion's impacts on water. And what we can do about that. Then we're going to Tom Williams of World Business Council for Sustainable Development, who's going to focus much more on climate and carbon. And then we've got Nicole Rycroft of Canopy, who's going to talk to us about forests, one of the most essential living systems, pieces of biodiversity that we need to keep intact and thriving to survive in our world for climate and for nature. She's going to talk about forests and very tangible actions about what this sector can do, because this sector, it's not just about reducing our impact, it's about creating positive outcomes. It's about empowering and inspiring our consumers with the products that we produce and the way we produce them in a new world where we deliver positive outcomes and not just talk about less bad, but talk about more good. So we've got a great challenge ahead of us, huge opportunities, and we have some incredible expertise, knowledge, and methodologies to really back up our actions. So, and set our targets, right? So let's get started with Janice. If you could start, and let's launch right into this, and then hopefully please send your questions through as we go, and we will tackle them as much as we can, and we'll wrap this up at the end. Then you'll move into these different breakout groups, as Kelly said. Okay, over to you, Janice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for the warm welcome. I hope everybody can hear me. And a big congratulations and shout out to the WARE webinar series for hosting such a successful event. So I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of PwC to talk a little bit more about climate science, climate change, the impact that it has from a fashion industry perspective, but also what that might mean for our planetary boundaries and how the industry is coming together and accelerating action as it relates to science targets. And then, of course, some of the reduction initiatives that are being experimented with today. You know, when we think about the fashion industry, there really has been over the past few years a growing discourse on the real impact that fashion has. And while this is $1 billion industry, there's a recognition today that when you think about fast fashion and the notion of a bit of our sort of linear, sort of throwaway type of culture, what will that mean as we move forward into a global agenda of sustainable development? Today, we have a number of different studies with various sort of analysis into the impact of the fashion industry from the World Economic Forum, the Global Fashion Agenda, with the McKinsey study that recently came out. And there's claims now that it looks as if the impact of the fashion industry could range from between 4 to 10% of global carbon emissions. And that to add on to is that the fact of, you know, the fashion industry being the second largest consumer of the world's water supply, and more than 85% of textiles are now going to landfills, many of which contain microfibers that are entering our oceans, and especially from polyester, which is a high carbon intensive material. So this is sort of a stark realization and an important realization, and it's not only the fashion industry, it's all of our industrial sectors that we do need to be coming together with a new discourse and a new accelerated action plan for how we're going to meet our survival, not only as humans, but as an ecosystem. I thought it would be useful, given the context of today's session, to really understand what this means. And it really does anchor around these planetary boundaries. And as many of you know, in 2009, the Stockholm Resilience Center came up with 9 boundaries, really to talk about and identify what do we need to regulate and create a resilient Earth, a resilient ecosystem. And within that, they identified these boundaries that we absolutely need if we are to thrive and to develop for generations to come. So any step to crossing these boundaries fundamentally means that we risk generating large-scale, abrupt, and even irreversible environmental damage that will not only impact our livelihoods, our economy, but the devastation of our ecosystem and health. So what you see here today is that climate change does take plays an important role, and I would even suggest that climate change plays an interrelationship role with other planetary boundaries. And so none of these are actually exclusive upon themselves. What's important to note is that we are reaching a very dire situation when it does come to climate, particularly as we move into the yellow bound, and we really must not cross into the sort of red ring around that, because at that point, it's forecasted that there will be irreversible damage resulting from climate change and climate events. All this to say is that the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is really made up of international think tanks, have really come out with transformational policies, one of which is to move forward and absolutely implement the Paris Agreement as part of the science behind the climate change agenda. So what does that actually really mean? Setting a science-based target is really about the Paris Agreement, where countries came together to agree to limit warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it fundamentally to 1.5. And to do that, we absolutely need to hit net zero by 2050. So we are no longer on a trajectory of 2 degrees. And in fact, when the Paris Agreement did come together and the governments agreed on their national determination contributions, we are now in a situation that if we continue even with those commitments on the path that we are going, we're probably hitting about a 3.8 to 4.5 degree world. So there's a real discourse and an urgency for accelerated action, particularly with all sectors, but also, and very importantly, within the fashion industry. So following the Paris Agreement, really important to note that there has been a lot of positive action for the fashion sector. Through the United Nations, there has been a collaboration with various organizations who really came together at COP24 in 2018 to really set the stage for action by signing on to the Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action. And fundamentally what that meant was a vision for reaching net zero, a formal commitment to get to 30% of greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030, and then an additional commitment to continue to decarbonize through establishing and developing a science-based target. The charter was actually launched by approximately 46 companies, and today we have 109 members and organizations working together to really advance and amplify best practices. The focus being very much on not only energy efficiency and renewables, but really looking at materials, textiles, fabrics, the way they're produced, the impact towards lower emitting fabrics, regenerative agriculture, more efficient transportation systems, and even awareness with consumers in terms of the longevity, the recycling, the reuse of materials. Within that context, we have seen some very interesting developments also happen in terms of the guidance that's out there on how do you go about setting a science-based target, very much published, released, collaborated through the Science-Based Target Initiative that many of you are aware of. And the importance of the specific sector guidance, particularly for apparel and footwear, has really been in the clarity that it brings on measurement. This is not an easy subject. There's a lot of criteria and considerations. And during our breakout session, following this event, we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. I think just quickly on the fashion sector's emission profile, really important to recognize that majority of it is coming through the value chain, upstream and downstream, and a significant part through the materials that are being used, their production, their processing, and then their final assembly. So a lot of activity will be happening in that area. We are seeing more and more companies innovating, really setting the bar quite high through better sourcing strategies, engagement and collaboration with suppliers, wonderful initiatives to redesign for circularity and move away from our linear production systems, shifting to more sustainable transportation, and even work on packaging and zero plastic, which is absolutely fantastic. And of course now really moving to the discourse and touching the consumer and generating greater awareness in terms of how products are used. and then of course reused and recycled back into the system. So there's a lot of progress being made, and I do think that it's important to reflect on how far we've come. As indicated, you know, there has been, since the Paris Agreement, a steep increase in the setting of science-based targets. Today, we have 992 companies globally that have committed, and of which 463 have formal targets. And when you look at the commitments that are coming from the fashion sector, through apparel, through retailers, you know, we have 55 companies that have committed, and of course 25 that are now formally setting their targets. So it's a really exciting time for the sector. There's a lot to do, but very keen to get into a discussion on that, as well as our follow-up session to talk to you more about how to do so. Thank you very much. And Helen, I'll pass it back to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Janice. That was a great framing of the issue and the challenge that we have ahead. We've only got 1 or 2 questions that have come through, so I think we'll segue to Tom. And the questions are quite general, so we'll come back and do them afterwards. So Tom, over to you. Tom from World Business Council for Sustainable Development, to talk about water and the priorities for the sector in water. Thanks, Tom.
Just unmute. Thank you so much, Helen. Thanks for that introduction. And to talk about water, we're probably quite a few years behind what we've just heard about there with carbon, but some commonalities in how we're starting to come together to address this. Before I move on to talk about water, just a brief introduction to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're a membership organization. We have about 200 multinational companies who are members. What they all have in common is that they embed sustainability within their business models and their governance structures. And the way we organize ourselves is around systems transformation. So we work in programs, and within programs, we have a number of projects that we work on. So water is one of the projects that we collaborate with our members on, and we've been working on water for over 15 years now on issues like water valuation, circular water management, water risk mapping. And we've also published a CEO guide for water back in 2018. Now, generally speaking, when we talk of water challenges, you can look at 3 perspectives. There's the quantity issue. You know, business as usual, the trajectory means that by 2030, demand will outstrip supply by 40%. Secondly, there's the quality issue. 80% of all wastewater is currently discharged without any treatment directly into the environment. And then the third issue is context. Of course, in all countries, the demand supply issue is not going to be 40%. 80% of wastewater is not discharged without being treated in all countries. So context is extremely important when we talk about water targets and actions. I want to focus on the quality aspect because next week we are publishing a report called Wastewater Zero, which zones in on this quality aspect. And it talks about the business risks and business opportunities as it relates to wastewater. And we framed this in a climate context, in a freshwater biodiversity context, and in a water context, because untreated wastewater contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, it negatively impacts on freshwater biodiversity, and it decreases the amount of good quality water that's available. So within this report, we lay out an action framework, and a key part of that action framework is establishing science-based targets for water. And we also have a mechanism whereby companies can commit to wastewater zero and raise their ambition to SDG 6.3. SDG 6.3 is about water quality and in part is about wastewater. And this commitment compels business to strive towards zero pollution. So ensuring that zero hazardous substances are released into the environment. Second of all, it compels business to increase the proportion of water that is recycled and reused. So not increasing the amount of fresh water that is used, but increasing the amount of water that is recycled and reused. And the last part is to ensure that all wastewater is treated in a low carbon way. Now, this is where decisions need to be made about increasing the amount of wastewater that is treated, but doing so that doesn't pass on the negative impact to the climate. One of the aspects that's included in the report is some priority sectors, and one of those priority sectors is the apparel sector. What you see on the screen is collecting data from the CDP water survey that they carry out every year, and this is to do with risk exposure. So the larger the green circle, the larger the magnitude of the risk exposure to that particular sector. Two key things which should really make water pollution a high risk for sectors is to do with their dependency on good quality fresh water and their potential to release polluting substances into the environment. So you'll see the apparel sector actually has quite low risk exposure according to the CDP water survey. So this informs us that the apparel sector is probably underestimating the risk to do with water pollution and is externalizing some of those risks to other stakeholders, which could be downstream stakeholders, including farmers and other industries. So there's clearly something here that the apparel sector has to do to look more closely at its value chain as it relates to wastewater risk pollution, and also look at downstream of operations, their own operations and their value chain operations. So this starts to inform some of the thinking behind corporate water targets. Now, to date, most corporate water targets are to do with reducing the amount of water that is withdrawn, and these are normally global targets. There are some corporates that do have effluent discharge targets. They might have prioritized certain sites where they want to take action, but in the main, most corporate water targets are about a global figure to reduce withdrawals. And there's three areas which really mean that those targets can be misguided and not driving the right action. First of all, reducing 10% water withdrawals in the Netherlands is different to reducing 10% water withdrawals in India. Going back to that point on context, context is so important whether you're operating or a value chain in water abundant environments or water scarce environments. It's really critical to understand the context. Second of all, most of the current corporate water targets are actually backwards looking. They'll have a baseline year, and then they will have a target to improve upon that by a certain percentage. Now, corporate water targets need to be more forward looking. What is sustainable water use within a particular context? And what is a corporation's actions towards that sustainable water use? So instead of looking back at what your performance was in 2015 and having a percentage improvement as a target, you need to look forward, understand what sustainable water use is in a particular context, and derive your targets from there. And then the third challenge with many water corporate targets at the moment is that they don't incorporate this dimension of quality, whether that's the quality of use or it's the quality of discharge. So where we're working towards from these quite non-conceptual targets is working towards more contextual targets. There was a publication that was released last year. You see on the screen, setting site water targets informed by catchment context. So this starts to provide some guidance to companies to look at the local context, the catchment context, help them understand what they need to consider in setting those contextual targets. The next part of the journey then is to bring in the science, and there within the science-based target network that Helen mentioned, there is a freshwater hub, which is currently discussing science-based targets, both in terms of how you determine those science-based targets, but also the guidance behind them. And this really enables business to set targets that are about the right things in the right place and are based on science. And I think it's also important to consider how water impacts and depends on some of the other science-based targets, those that exist for climate and those in development for ocean, land and biodiversity. For example, taking action on climate, reducing GHG emissions will have an impact on the long-term frequency of water-related disasters, floods and droughts, for example. So taking action on climate is also taking action on water. And if you take action on wastewater pollution, some of it inevitably ends up in the oceans. You're taking action on oceans as well. And I think this is something that we can maybe explore a bit more in the panel discussion, is these interconnectivity and interdependencies of science-based targets across these different nature pieces. So I'll stop there. I will go into a little bit more detail as part of the breakout group, but hopefully that frames a little bit the current thinking and challenges around corporate water targets.
Perfect, thanks Tom. We've had a few little questions coming through. Some we've already answered, but keep them coming, please, because we're after Nicole, we're going to have a question, answer and discussion period. So, but right now let's segue into forests and what it is that the fashion sector can and can't do around forests, and why are they particularly important for us. Nicole, please, over to you.
All right, thanks. And hi, everybody, and thanks to Kelly and the team for pulling off yet another fabulous conference, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Yeah, I'm excited to be here, and I'm, as Helen introduced, I'm going to sort of dive in and explore forest ecosystems as forests are home to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity and are seen to be 30% of the climate solution. But before I go there, quick introduction to Canopy. We're a solutions-driven, not-for-profit organization that is focused on helping to protect the world's forests, biodiversity, climate, and advancing community rights. We do this by harnessing the power of the marketplace, and currently work with about 750 large corporate customers of the forest products industry, mainly companies that are using either a lot of paper, a lot of packaging, or a lot of wood-based fabrics like rayon and viscose, where we work with those brands and companies collaboratively right through their supply chain to drive change on the ground. Historically, we've been known for greening the Harry Potter book series, and in recent years, over the last 7 years, we've been working with the apparel sector. And that focus has really been on transforming the viscose supply chain to ensure that man-made cellulosic fabrics, be it rayon or viscose or modal, that they don't become even more entrenched drivers of deforestation and forest degradation. There are 150 million trees that disappear into these fabrics every year. But over the last 7 years, Canopy Style has emerged as one of the faster and fastest moving environmental initiatives within the apparel sector. And that's really largely in thanks to our fantastic brand partners. And in her kind of normal day job, Helen is one of those spectacular partners. But these brands we have 320 brands representing $580 billion in annual revenues, and they all have commitments to not source from the world's ancient and endangered forests, to work together and with Canopy and a broader movement to help conserve and protect these landscapes, and to really accelerate our transition to next generation solutions that are fundamentally more circular. And because of brands sending a very consistent message and engaging their suppliers, viscose producers that represent about 85% of global viscose production have similar policies in place. And we anticipate by the end of the year, we will have more than 50% of that supply chain verified at low risk of sourcing from ancient and endangered forests. And the first commercial products are on the market that contain waste textiles as part of the feedstock. So in a relatively short period of time, we've seen kind of quite a significant shift in the impacts of this supply chain, which is a good thing, because as my colleagues have spoken to already, you know, the context of our times, I think we're all aware of it. Pretty much any time you pick up a scientific journal, you're almost tempted to reach for a bottle of scotch or a or a vial of Valium at the same time. Like this is a turnaround decade, clearly, for our planet as well as for humanity. And so the science is very clear, even with science that's rolling out literally on a weekly basis. And so I think, you know, the science-based target work that has been done around climate has I think, really helped reinforce that case for science-based targets. If we're not measuring it, then we're not tracking it, and then we're not working to save it. And so the introduction and the work that's happening now to really develop robust science-based targets for nature are really going to be, I think, a critical contribution to this space. And because you can't kind of measure it by ton or by degrees, there is a complexity with developing those specific metrics. And so as that work is happening, there is still an overwhelming body of contextual targets in science that we can be motivated to move by. And so the scientific community have been crystal clear that we need to be protecting 30 to 50% of the world's forests by 2030. That's going to require us to significantly change business as usual practice. It requires us to transform damaging extractive supply chains, and recognizing that Canopy has mapped a blueprint for the scale of change that's required in this turnaround decade between now and 2030 for the pulp, paper, packaging, and wood-based fabric supply chain. And we called it Survival, a Pulp Thriller, because what better for a cliffhanger of a decade than a pulp thriller? And this blueprint really kind of maps out, if we're to protect 30 to 50% of the world's forests, then we need to stop relying on forest ecosystems to be the feedstock for all of the paper and the wood-based packaging and the clothing and the myriad of other products that we rely on forest ecosystems for, so that we can actually leave them standing, help conserve them, restore them, so that they can provide us with these vital life services like a stable climate, clean water, precipitation cycles, biodiversity. And so this is the roadmap for how to enable that, to have the transition of 50% of the wood that's currently being used, have a modest reduction target, but also a rapid transition over to fundamentally more sustainable alternatives like agricultural residues, waste textiles, and microbial cellulose. And so this is what that scale up looks like. We mapped where the fiber is, where the mills could and should be located, as well as the scale of investment. It's a $69 billion price tag, which is, you know, not something that I have in my piggy bank. But in 2018, Botox sold for $68 billion. And so our sense is that if the world can afford $68 billion for Botox, we can probably afford $69 billion to save the planet. So obviously, you know, to make this scale of change happen, it requires a galvanization by all parties across society. And brands have a really important role to play within that. And so I've kind of narrowed it down into 3 buckets, but there are obviously significant drop-down menus underneath in terms of how that can look. But activating your purchasing power is really kind of like an easy go-to. You know, the days for sourcing from high carbon, biodiverse, rich ecosystems and landscapes are behind us. We just don't have the luxury from a climate and a biodiversity perspective for that anymore. So stepping in to really enable the accelerated on-ramping of these next generation solutions, these circular economy solutions, by developing offtake agreements to help de-risk the early stage tech, piloting and prioritizing early adoption of them, ensuring that the solutions that are already available, like recycled content for packaging, is part of your rubric. Secondly, I think it's really taking the leap, channeling the inner activist within and drawing inspiration from the millions of young people that have been on the streets up until recent months, and advocating, like really engaging your suppliers, having them come to the negotiations table and sit down with NGOs and talk about landscape level conservation. That's exactly what customer companies did in the Great Bear Rainforest, which is a remarkable landscape on the west coast of Canada. And that landscape went from 90% of it being open for logging to 85% of it being legally protected or off limits to logging. And customer engagement in that realm was absolutely critical, as it was also with engaging governments to shift policies to advance conservation in that region, but also obviously engaging governments to shift policies around the acceleration and support and enabling of next generation solutions. Obviously, none of us can do this by ourselves. And so obviously the really leaning in, working together, things that have historically been in a competitive space as businesses and as civil society, we need to be moving both the transition to next generation solutions in a circular economy into a pre-competitive space. We need to be working together on securing the scale of conservation that's required in a pre-competitive space as well. And, you know, there's a lot of process that can swing in as we move towards these sort of this kind of work. And so that's where targets, I think, are really helpful, because we need to sort of, you know, good process is important, but we really need to be prioritizing timelined, outcome focused change vehicles and investing in them in terms of time, expertise, smarts, creativity, as well as with financial investments. And so I think I'll just close with, you know, this is a turnaround decade, obviously, and it's going to take all of us to drive the scale of change that's proportional to the challenges that we're grappling with. And even though the science-based targets for nature are still in development, we have more than enough science to obviously be taking action and driving change. And I think our experience within Canopy Style, seeing the scale of change that we've been able to drive with our brand partners and producers, as well as other civil society, has really inspired us with the fact that we can actually shift the dial if we all lean into it.
Thank you, Nicole. I would just add a little sort of a little publicity also for Canopy Style, is that what I think, while they've created a tremendous blueprint for action in this space with forest-based resources for fashion and how to move through to a more sustainable place, they also in themselves are a bit of a blueprint in how they have over the last 7 years highlighted an issue with the private sector, collaborated with companies to figure out the solution, identify a pathway forward, the certifications, the collaborations, the collective vision that's needed to create, and now moving to a next phase of really looking for how we invest in those different solutions. So, I mean, congratulations to you all. I mean, I think that is an interesting way, shows how much you can achieve in a collaborative sort of collective way, but with some very specific focus on what you want to get at the end and the target. So thank you all for that. So Nicole, there is a specific question for Canopy in the chat box about your blueprint. Does it take into account forest fires? I thought if you could tap a response to that, everyone can see it, because I wanted to throw out a couple of general questions in this stage of you've all done brilliantly, by the way. I should have said that first, on timing. Thank you so much for keeping to time. Sabine put a question in very early on in our session on, I'll read it out because I think it delves into a couple of really important issues. I heard that in order to stay in this safe operating space, we need to go back to pre-industrial stage. Is this correct? What is the level we need to go back? So I wanted to sort of put it out to Janice and Tom and Nicole. I mean, what are the key things we really need to be thinking about? Are we saying to go back to sort of pre-industrial revolution, or do you think there's the technology, and what is it that we need in each of your sectors? You think, what's sort of a key trigger to unlock change to pull us in on, keep us within that safe operating space? So, and give us an example if you have one. The other thing I'm going to ask you about, I'm giving you a heads up, is who pays for all this? Ideas on how do we fund all this? Companies can put a certain amount in, but how do we support this transition? I'm giving you that as a heads up. But first, this idea of, okay, do we all have to go to a horse and plow, basically, in agriculture? What are we going to do? Now, Janice, would you like to throw some ideas out there on that?
Sure. So I'll just start by giving a bit of perspective from the climate science. The International Panel on Climate Change has really set the framework and the foundation for what does it mean to be pre-industrial. And when we think about pre-industrial, we're really thinking through sort of a period of time, sort of pre-1900, right? Before the Industrial Revolution. And during that time, our temperature did increase, as we all know. However, the unprecedented nature of that increase during and after the Industrial Revolution has been quite significant. So the science has today indicated that in order for us to remain within our planetary boundary, and going back to the Stockholm Center for Resilience is really the notion that we cannot have devastating environmental impacts that are irreversible. And so the science is saying that we need to go to a 1.5 degree stabilization of our temperature increase with a reference point of pre-industrial levels. So if you put that into context and you look at ourselves today, as of, for example, 2017, our temperature has increased 1 degree. And the IPCC has indicated that over the next, every decade, we are forecasting to increase by 0.2 degrees. So that puts us at, by 2040, approximately 1.5. So what that means is that we need to build in a lot of contingency, and we need to be able to demonstrate and get to a point that before 2050, we are actually stabilizing to net zero. So I think that that is a daunting task. It's a daunting task, particularly because our economy is growing. The fashion industry is $1 billion sector, and our population is growing in kind. And so we have an important role to be thinking about what prosperity really looks like. What does it mean to stabilize? And how does that impact growth? How does that impact populations? And what role then does industry play within that to move towards more sustainable and circular systems?
Great, thanks. Tom, what do you think about this idea of how do we is it technology that is going to get us to this sort of pre-industrial state that we need to be, or when it comes to water?
I guess the simple and quick answer is it's a little bit of everything. It's technical solutions, policy, finance, etc. But I guess underpinning all of that is good data and information. Now, if we look at globally water, 70% of water withdrawals are for agriculture, 20% is for industry, and then 10% is for domestic use. That varies from region to region. In Asia, it's up to 80% it is used for agriculture, and in Europe, industry accounts for maybe 40%. And then the other piece of this is, on planetary boundaries, which informs so much of what we're talking about today. Fresh water is one of the planetary boundaries where there isn't scientific consensus. And that being that, how can you have a global freshwater planetary boundary when you have so much disparity at a local level? So you have in some places water abundance, in some places water scarcity. So what's going on at the moment is that there is a team working on revising that freshwater planetary boundary so it can bring more nuance to it, and also understand how you can actually downscale that to a local catchment level, a basin or a watershed level. So all of this points towards context, right? So context-based information and knowledge is really going to drive that transformational change. The water SBT, as it will be developed, will provide some long overdue direction to corporations at the scale and the pace that they need to work at. But I would say don't wait for that water SBT to come out before you take action. 3 things that you can do now. Look beyond your fence lines, understand your value chain, understand downstream stakeholders that might be impacted by your water management. Second thing is to prioritize. Corporations have value chain partners, operations all over the place. Prioritize where water is really a material issue for your value chain partners and for your operations. And once you prioritize, engage in multi-stakeholder platforms. These are emerging in many different locations where it brings together private sector, public sector, civil society to talk about shared water challenges. And then the third thing to do is really embrace water circularity. These will be a major means to progress against water science-based targets. And ultimately, it's about keeping water in circulation for multiple purposes. So I think the science-based targets will provide some long overdue direction for corporates as it relates to their water targets and actions, but there's things that can be done now.
Great, I like that. 1, 2, 3, this is what you do. Thank you. Nicole, would you like to tackle this idea of the role of technology and getting us to pre-industrial, or would you like to talk about the investment side? Because I know you've been doing some interesting thinking on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're moving forward. We're not going back. I mean, that's my kind of the byline, I guess, of my response. And it requires, a redesign. And with that redesign, I think your opening comments, Helen, were really spot on. Like, this isn't just about mitigating risk anymore. I mean, this is about us as a society mitigating, risk to our survival. But I think this is really about now us helping to drive positive change and transitions to just a different way of doing and being. So consumption being kind of part of that. And there does need to be a massive mobilization of investment to enable the transition, the timely, accelerated, at scale adoption of circular economy technologies, these disruptive, game-changing, next-gen technologies. That's going to require, oftentimes it's equity that is the block at commercialization for these technologies to be able to move forward. And so I think it's really about us collectively leaning in, looking to structure vehicles, be they pooled equity funds or I think there's some really good work happening with incubator and accelerator programs, but that kind of mobilization of capital at scale at those critical junctures where the right technologies just can't kind of really break out of the pilot or the bench scale into market. But I think one of the things that I'm really encouraged by is with COVID-19 of all the human suffering notwithstanding within it. The one thing that I think COVID-19 has really shown is that we have an incredible ability to pivot quickly if we're motivated enough to do so or scared enough to do so. And so I think that is one of the silver linings with COVID-19 is it really does demonstrate, even though the scale of change that is in front of us is substantive, that we actually do have the ability to do so if we feel so motivated to change.
Great. Thank you. We've got a few minutes left. I would like each of you I'm going to give you one more sort of moment to sort of give the take-home messages, keeping in mind this idea of targets and target setting, and what would you say would be a takeaway for the companies listening that they need to do in the forest, in the water? I liked your 1, 2, 3, Tom. Would you like to reiterate that, or is there something that they can say, okay, I'm going to go back and do this. This is my first step, or my second step, or my third step, or whatever, to making sure I am hitting the right targets or designing the right action, no regrets actions, even if the targets aren't quite clear yet and the planetary boundaries are still being worked out. What are our no regrets actions that we should be taking right now? How about Janice? We go in the same order, Janice, Tom, and Nicole.
Sure.
Thanks.
Wonderful. So I will say, and I echo Tom's comment, which is really it does come down to measurement and really understanding your hotspots and your carbon inventory profile Scope 3 emissions, or what we call indirect emissions, are a significant component for the fashion industry. It's going to be very important to really understand raw materials. I think there's a comment here from Martha Kelleher, which I truly think brings out the comment of holistic land management. Regenerative agriculture is going to become incredibly important on the carbon agenda. And the notion of carbon sinks, and what does it mean to truly build capacity and engage with suppliers across the different tiers in the value chain, is going to be a huge component of the collaborative, the capacity building, the knowledge and awareness that's going to really pivot us. And then finally, I just do want to say that in many respects, all of us, particularly fashion, we're going through a transformation in technology and innovation. And a lot of that transformation is very tied to carbon. So there's a lot of opportunities in terms of how we go virtual, how we automate, how we change, and to do that in a way that is a just environment as well, so that we don't leave anyone behind as we move and make this transition. So I see this as a glass half full, a lot of opportunity, but it really underpinned by collaboration within the sector and real leadership as well, and ambition.
Thanks, Janice. Tom, over to you. A minute takeaway for everyone when they go back to their day jobs.
Thanks, Helen. I'll repeat those 3 items I mentioned earlier. Look beyond your fence lines, prioritise and embrace water circularity. Then I want to answer your investment question that you had earlier as well for water. And I think what's critical for water investment is that it's informed by water valuation. Water in most places is completely underpriced. So when you factor in what the true cost is, whether it's the energy, for example, but more significantly, the externalities of water, you start to understand the value of water. And when you understand the true economic impact of poor water management, investment decisions become much easier, because you're not just solving a water problem, you're solving environmental problems, climate problems, and societal problems as well. So I think in terms of mobilizing the significant amount of investment, public and private sector, which is needed for water, water valuation is really critical to that, because that kind of understanding is really going to drive investment decisions.
Great. I would reiterate that, having worked with the Environment Profit and Loss Account, the water valuation is very key to prioritizing where you act. Nicole?
Yeah, I think, sorry, just to riff off that investment piece, there is $5 to $6 trillion spent every year in subsidies by governments around the world on extractive industries and industrial agriculture. And so that is also a huge pot of money that can be kind of redirected to actually helping develop, supporting community development and economies that are actually fundamentally more compatible with the natural systems with which we're living. Sorry. So I wanted to make sure that we kind of had that kind of large pot of potential assets sort of on our radar. In terms of what can be done, I think it's really embracing the fact that by being in the apparel sector, you have incredible influence. You have your purchasing influence, you have your ability to engage your clients, as social curators and cultural influencers. There's an ability to really engage people in a dialogue about prioritizing sustainability. And then obviously with investment, I would really encourage for you to be leaning in with initiatives. Shamelessly, I'll do a plug for, if you're not already part of Canopy Style, then reach out to us about that. If you're using packaging, which I know everybody does, then reach out to us about joining Pack for Good, which is our initiative focused on transforming the wood-based packaging supply chain. Lean in and join initiatives like the Science Based Target Initiative or Network. It's really critical at this point that we have all hands on deck, and all hands on deck within initiatives and vehicles that have the ability to kind of leverage our individual actions to add up to be much greater in terms of the sum outcome that we deliver.
That was a good ending point. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you all. It's been a great panel. I just finish on a couple of final comments as my prerogative here. I think the idea that natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions are a powerful, powerful way forward. We've all alluded to that in different ways, that is part of our package of solutions. Knowing your supply chain and knowing the geography of your supply chain is the only way you're going to get to that 30%. That's 30% of the climate solution, and it's also a big part of the nature solution of these natural climate solutions. So know your supply chain, and then this collaboration across the supply chain, across sectors, and just start acting, knowing what's going on. There's enough knowledge in these multi-sectors, whether it's World Business Council, Canopy, with PwC, with all these sort of knowledge partners. We have the knowledge, we have the methodology. There are some gaps, but we can move forward on no regrets actions for nature and climate. There's some really, and fashion can be a force for good. You've heard it, but I totally believe that it can be a force for good, and you can recreate your value proposition for your customers through doing this nature, climate, positive action. So thank you all for listening. Great panel. Thank you, Kelly. All the best with the rest. And I think you're moving into breakout groups now.
That's right. Yes. Thank you all. Thank you, Janice, Nicole, Helen, and Tom. Great panel. We are now going to move into the breakout sessions. So I've shared the link in the chat. I've also sent an email to everybody who's registered. So please join the breakout, but then you have a few minutes to get refreshed, and then the breakouts will commence at 12:15 sharp. So thanks again. And also we do have a session at 2 that is going to be with the Business Development Bank of Canada, speaking with 2 B Corp companies, 10 Tree and Period Oil, about sort of leadership and resiliency, both throughout the pandemic and looking to the future. So that is definitely a session not to be missed, and that's at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thanks again, and we'll see you all very shortly in the breakout sessions. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.